Chapter 6 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 6. Firket. June 7, 1896. Since the end of 1895, the Dervish force in Firket had been under the command of the Emir Hammuda, and it was through the indolence and neglect of this dissipated Arab that the Egyptian army had been able to make good its position at Akasha without any fighting. Week after week the convoys had straggled unmolested through the difficult country between Sarras and the advanced base. No attack had been made upon the brigade at Akasha. No enterprise was directed against its communications. This fatal inactivity did not pass unnoticed by Wad Bishara, the governor of Dongola, but although he was nominally in supreme command of all the Dervish forces in the province, he had hardly any means of enforcing his authority. His rebukes and exhortations, however, gradually roused Hammuda, and during May 2 or 3 minor raids were planned and executed, and the Egyptian position at Akasha was several times reconnoitred. Bishara remained unsatisfied, and at length, despairing of infusing energy into Hammuda, he ordered his subordinate Osman Azrak to supersede him. Osman was a dervish of a very different type. He was a fanatical and devoted believer in the Mahdi and a loyal follower of the Khalifa. For many years he had served on the northern frontier of the Dervish Empire, and his name was well known to the Egyptian government as the contriver of the most daring and the most brutal raids. His cruelty to the wretched inhabitants of the border villages had excluded him from all hope of mercy should he ever fall into the hands of the enemy. His crafty skill, however, protected him, and among the emirs gathered at Firket there was none whose death would have given greater satisfaction to the military authorities than the man who was now to replace Hammuda. Whether Osman Azrak had actually assumed command on the 6th of June is uncertain. It seems more likely that Hammuda declined to admit his right, and that the matter still stood in dispute. But in any case Osman was determined to justify his appointment by his activity, and about midday he started from the camp at Firket and, accompanied by a strong patrol of camel men, set out to reconnoitre Akasha. Moving cautiously, he arrived unperceived within sight of the position at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The columns which were to storm Firket at dawn were then actually parading. But the clouds of dust which the high wind drove across and whirled about the camp obscured the view, and the dervish could distinguish nothing unusual. He therefore made the customary pentagonal mark on the sand to ensure good luck, and so returned to Firket to renew his dispute with Hammuda, bearing the reassuring news that the Turks lay quiet. The force which the Sirdar had concentrated for the capture of Firket amounted to about 9,000 men, and was organized as follows: Commander-in-Chief, the Sirdar. The Infantry Division, Colonel Hunter commanding. 1st Brigade, Major Lewis, with the 3rd Egyptians, 4th Egyptians, and 10th Sudanese. 2nd Brigade, commanded by Major MacDonald, with the 9th Sudanese, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th Sudanese. 3rd Brigade, commanded by Major Maxwell, with the 2nd, 7th, and 8th Egyptians. Mounted forces under Major Byrne Murdoch, the Egyptian cavalry of 7 squadrons, the Camel Corps of 8 companies. Artillery. Horse artillery, 1 battery. Field artillery, 2 batteries. Maxim guns, 1 battery. 2 roads led from Akasha to Firket, one by the bank of the river, the other inland and along the projected railway line. The Sirdar determined to avail himself of both. The force was therefore divided into 2 columns. The main column, under the command of the Sirdar, was to move by the river road and consisted of the infantry division, the field artillery, and the Maxim guns. The desert column, under command of Major Byrne Murdoch, consisted of the mounted forces, the horse artillery, and 1 battalion of infantry, the 12th Sudanese, drawn from MacDonald's brigade and mounted upon camels, in all about 2,000 men. Very precise orders were given to the smaller column, and Burn Murdoch was instructed to occupy the hills to the southeast of the centre of Firket village by 4:30 a.m., to dispose his force facing west, with the cavalry on the left, the Camel Corps in the centre, and the 12th Soudanese on the right. The only point left to his discretion was the position to be occupied by the Horse Battery. He was especially warned not to come under the fire of the main infantry force. As soon as the enemy should be routed, the 12th Soudanese were to return to the Sirdar. The cavalry, camelry, and horse artillery were to pursue, the objective being, firstly, Koyeka, and secondly, Suarda. The infantry column began to march out of Akasha at 3:30 in the afternoon of the 6th, and trailed southwards along the track by the river in the following order: Lewis's brigade, with the 10th Soudanese leading, 2 Maxim guns and the artillery, MacDonald's brigade, Maxwell's brigade, and lastly, the field hospitals and a half-battalion forming rear guard. The Sirdar marched behind the artillery. The rear of the long column was clear of the camp by 4:30, and about 2 hours later the mounted force started by the desert road. The river column made good progress till dark, but thereafter the advance was slow and tedious. The track led through broken rocky ground, and was so narrow that it nowhere allowed a larger front to be formed than of 4 men abreast. In some places the sharp rocks and crumbling heaps of stone almost stopped the gun mules altogether, while the infantry tripped and stumbled painfully. The moon had not yet risen, and the darkness was intense. Still the long procession of men, winding like a whiplash between the jagged hills, toiled onward through the night, with no sound except the tramping of feet and the rattle of accoutrements. At 10:30, the head of Lewis's brigade debouched into a smooth, sandy plain about a mile to the north of Sarkamato village. This was the spot, scarcely 3 miles from the enemy's position, where the Sirdar had decided to halt and bivouac. The bank and foreshore of the river were convenient for watering, all bottles and skins were filled, and soldiers and animals drank. A little food was eaten, and then, battalion by battalion, as the force arrived at the halting place, they lay down to rest. The tail of Maxwell's brigade reached the bivouac about midnight, and the whole column was then concentrated. Meanwhile, the mounted force were also on their way. Like the river column, they were disordered by the broken ground, and the 12th Soudanese, who were unused to camel riding and mounted only on transport saddles, were soon wearied. After 1 o'clock many men, both in the Camel Corps and in the battalion, fell asleep on their camels, and the officers had great difficulty in keeping them awake. However, the force reached their point of concentration, about 3 miles to the southeast of Firket, at 2:45. Here the 12th Soudanese dismounted from their camels and became again a fighting unit. Leaving the extra camels under a guard, Major Burn Murdoch then advanced towards his appointed position on the hills overlooking Firket. The Sirdar moved on again with the infantry at 2:30. The moon had risen over the rocks to the left of the line of march, but it was only a thin crescent and did not give much light. The very worst part of the whole track was encountered immediately the bivouac was left, and the column of nearly 6,000 men had to trickle through one narrow place in single file. There were already signs of the approach of dawn, the Dervish camp was near, the Sirdar and his staff began to look anxious. He sent many messages to the leading battalions to hurry, and the soldiers, although now very weary, ran and scrambled through the difficult passage like sheep crowding through a gate. By 4 o'clock the leading brigade had cleared the obstacle, and the most critical moment seemed to have passed. Suddenly, a mile to the southward, rose the sound of the beating of drums. Everyone held his breath. The Dervishes were prepared. Perhaps they would attack the column before it could deploy. Then the sound died away, and but for the clatter of the marching columns all was again silent. It was no alarm, but only the call to the morning prayer, and the Dervishes, still ignorant that their enemies approached and that